Good day, goeiedag, fellow South Africans, and I'm really pleased that I came across the video that I've attached here. It's very, very comprehensive, and it looks into where is South Africa going by the year 2030. So you're looking at 12 years ahead, what's going to happen in South Africa. There are four options that this fellow claims could happen. And the most damaging thing that could happen is land expropriation without compensation. And that's a huge part of his presentation. Look, I'll let you guys watch it. It's very informative. It's very detailed. And if you're South African, you really need to get your head around what he's talking about. All right, guys. I hope you have a great weekend. Take care.
Please. This is, for those of you who are familiar with our events, quite obviously one of our better attended events. We've, I think, got something like 130 people here. Simultaneous broadcast in a neighbouring room, and some people had to be turned away. So it's great to have you, and we are here gathered obviously because we have a formidable speaker. There's been a live podcast doing the rounds that's sort of gone viral, and I suppose one of the attractions is that many of you have received it and heard it, and you want to come and hear the full story, the full Monty. Frans directs the Centre for Risk Analysis, which helps business and government leaders plan for the future of South Africa and to identify policies that will create a more prosperous society. It uses deep dive data analysis and first-hand political and policy information to advise groups with interests in South Africa on the likely long-term economic, social and political evolution of the country. Through the Centre for Risk Analysis, CRA, Frans has advised several hundred organizations. He is author of 2 books on South Africa's future and teaches scenario-based strategy at the Business School of the University of the Free State. He was educated at St. John's College, Houghton, and holds a PhD in scenario planning. This briefing reviews the major socio-economic trends shaping the country and distills these into 4 scenarios for South Africa's route to 2030. Each scenario is presented with markets and forecasts that enable decision makers to position themselves to match likely outcomes. So that's just a long way of saying he's going to tell us what's about to happen. He's bold, and I happen to know that his analysis is probably not going to send you all home feeling overjoyed. So who knows? I have the last word when I think and close, and I might just leave you with a positive note of some sort. I'll be sitting there thinking what it might be. So with that, over to Frans. Tighten your seatbelts. I think you're in for a ride of somebody who is intellectually formidable, very, very knowledgeable, compelling, and get ready for quite a roller coaster ride of ideas and information. Over to Frans.
Leon, thank you very much. Good evening to you all. It's a pleasure to be at the Free Market Foundation. I'm an analyst essentially, and I work for a think tank, as many of you will know, the Institute for Race Relations, but I spend a lot of my time in the Centre for Risk Analysis, which is the advisory arm of the IRR. And my brief this evening is to try and answer the question implicit in that title. What is happening today? Why is it happening? And as Leon said, the Holy Grail is what's going to happen next. And about 40 minutes from now, if we pull this off, I leave you with what will hopefully be a fairly clear description of our country, the way it will look 1 year after the election in 2029. Before I take you into the future, I have to take you back into the past. Otherwise, you will struggle to go along with some of the conclusions that we're going to reach this evening. And I take you back specifically, many of you will remember what happened there, to the evening of the 15th of August 1985. Pierre Botha has gone to Durban to address the National Party under circumstances not dissimilar to these today. The economy is nowhere, debt levels escalating, high levels of political instability, massive investor uncertainty. And against that context, he'll tell the National Party faithful that evening, one quote from that night, that I will not lead white South Africa down the path of abdication and suicide. And it's arguably the darkest moment that apartheid could reach in the face of the evidence. Botha says we're not open to reform. But if an analyst had stood before you a few weeks after that, late August, early September of 1985, and said that for everything you see around you, and what Botha has just said, within a decade, the last leader of the National Party will become the tourism minister in an ANC cabinet. And Leon now knows how to send you off with sense that maybe things may turn around. When my colleagues and I sit to answer this question, a lot of our thinking starts on this graphic over here. It's 1994 projected into 2019, and the first thing I show you is the number of people with a job. Started at around 8 million, will break through the 13 million level towards the middle of the era, that's 2006-07, whereafter the rate of increase in job creation will begin to slow down. The lift that you see over here is in part the 25% increase in the size of the civil service, a civil service that in 2007 was essentially the same size as it had been in 1994, a comment on the conservatism of the initial years after the democratic transition. Since around 2014, virtually zero net new job creation. Behind that, I'll show you the number of social grants paid every month. Starts at 2 million. There's a policy change in the cabinet. The accelerated grants rollout. By the middle of the era, we'll break through 13 million grants. In 2009, for the first time, there are more grant recipients than people in employment, and the employment number includes the informal sector, whereafter the rate of increase in grants rollout will also begin to slow down. The third indicator I'll show you is real per capita GDP. If you could see the 1980s that are to the left of the graphic, in 1990 we were on this measure 20% poorer than we'd been in 1980. We'll stabilize through the transition years, and as the Asian crisis released its grip on South Africa, from roughly 2000 to the peak point here through to December of 2007, what you're looking at is the fastest increase in real per capita GDP since the first half of the 1960s. The latter period to 2007, 2004 to 7, the first time the economy had maintained an average growth rate of 5% of GDP or above for 4 consecutive years since 1970, today almost 50 years ago. The blip you correctly identify as the global financial crisis. The economy will bounce off the floor of the crisis. Growth will cling to 3% for 2 more years in 2010 and 11. And then as the rest of the world grows out of the financial crisis, South Africa's growth rate will fall away. And in real terms, we begin to plateau. And in the latter years, year after year, real per capita GDP, South Africans become a little bit poorer. And this is all in aid of an opening point that's very simple, that the first half of the era after 94 show the things that make your life get better increase very quickly. And in the second half of the era, those things began to slow down. Because that era, the second half, was so tough, we've forgotten in many respects that our country today is a fundamentally better place to live in than it was 25 years ago. When Mr. Mandela appeared at Davos in 1991, 44 whites were getting a degree in engineering for every black graduate. Now there are twice as many black as white engineering graduates, but the number of white is no lower than it was in 1991. In 1996, 58% of families in the country had access to electricity, and that's now gone to over 90%. And there are few emerging markets that can compete with some of the macro service delivery successes recorded by the ANC and government here over the past 20 years. And if that statement jars with what you read and experience, consider this. This is the one we get a lot of flack for this argument. We were accused wonderfully once of being better at this stuff than Mac Maharaj when he spoke for Jacob Zuma. But we win the argument with this one, that for every shack built after 1994, 10 formal houses were built in the country. And the idea of a country overwhelmed by poverty and desperation doesn't hang together quite as easily as the media can sometimes make it seem. This is the employment dependency ratio. It measures how many people are not working for every 100 people with a job at all age groups. In 1994 it was 380, but it's fallen to 251, consistent with a still rising rate of unemployment, because behind this data sits the labour market participation rate, which was very low in the early 1990s and has increased to a significant degree, always a positive indicator. But therefore demand for work has also increased, maintaining a high rate of unemployment even as the number of people with jobs has doubled. And in 1998 there were 340 people in the country for every nurse. Now there are 194 dependent on every nurse. And these aren't the four things that went right after 1994. They are indicative of thousands of similar trends that my analyst colleagues have collected over the years, and they all point to a country that has made substantive progress in the living standards of millions of people sustained over the past 2 decades. South Africans don't see it that way, though. This is 2000 to 2017, and what you're looking at is the answer to an opinion poll question. Do you believe the country's moving in the right direction? 70% of people said yes in the peak period between 2004 and 2007, when growth broke through 5% for that 4-year window for the first time then in just over 4 decades. But in the decade to today, popular confidence in the future, or to the middle of last year, had fallen by 40 percentage points. And only 1 in 3 South Africans now believed that the country was moving in the right direction. You must be very cautious of correlations or coincidence factors or anything of that nature. But we think there may be a relationship between what you see here and voting support for the ANC, shown this time at local government level, peaking for the ANC at 66% in 2006 to fall by just over 10 percentage points a decade later. That 66% coming 2 years after the record all-time high point, when at 69% the ANC was more popular than when Mr. Mandela had led it a decade previously. About 18 months ago or so, some of the state security people came to see us and said, "You guys know this stuff, it's what you do. Our political principals are very worried about what's going on here, and what do you think it is?" And we said to them, it's not state capture or the Gupta family or Nkandla or corruption or any of those things in the main. But your problem has its origins in this indicator, the real change in the after-tax income of families. As families become prosperous more quickly, they seem to become happier. And as they get prosperous more slowly, they get a bit worried. And when that reverses, they think it's only a blip. But if you maintain that pattern for a decade, they become very worried and unhappy indeed. Courtesy of the police, we obtain this data. The number essentially of violent anti-government protests every year. From 2004 into 2015, lifting from 1,000 to 3,500 incidents, and my warnings about correlations and the like notwithstanding, when you put the real change in the after-tax income of families over the protest data, there's some sort of inverse thing going on here. The latest numbers have been said to me, and they show a marked increase in levels of violent protest since 2015. We are in the early stages of developing a protest movement. If we step back a bit to try and understand what it is that got us to this point, part of the explanation rests in what's been happening in our country's economy. 1994 to 2017, South Africa's economic growth rate, averaging 3% into 2003, the 4 years averaging 5%, the global crisis, the bounce off the floor of the crisis, the last 2 years of 3% growth, and then the fall away to the low point of 2016, 0.3%, and the very low 1.3% of last year. On top of that, the world's rate of economic growth. And the two will follow each other fairly closely to our peak point through the crisis and back out, but only to 2013. And as the fragile global recovery continued, South Africa's growth rate peeled away. First time we'd really seen that pattern pronounced since the late 1970s, a function of the policy catastrophe engineered in South Africa's cabinet. When we saw this grow year after year, we told clients we called it the crocodile that's opening its mouth and it's going to bite us. And yesterday it bit us very hard indeed. When we were growing at 5%, this is what was happening to the year-on-year change in levels of fixed investment that has subsequently fallen flat, supported by record year-on-year increases in levels of consumer expenditure, equivalent to 60% of GDP. But bear in mind that in this early stage, interest rates in 1996 are still over 20%, and they'll be cut in half on the back of household debt levels 25 percentage points off where they are today. The combination of falling interest rates and untapped consumer expenditure helped to make possible this expansion in expenditure, supporting the fixed investment levels to pull economic growth to 5%. The consumer probably now too stressed to do that again, meaning an economic recovery, if there is to be one, will have to come out of much higher levels of investor confidence, failing which we won't address this. The year-on-year change in levels of formal sector employment, pedestrian over the full era. But there's definitely something going on in this 2004 to 2007 window. We're going to get back to the employment data 2 or 3 times still this evening and start to use it as a political marker and indicator. Because of what happened over here, the past decade in our economy, the South African government has started to run out of money, which might turn out to be a very good thing if it focuses the mind, as it tends to do with anyone who starts to run out of money. This is 1979 to 2020. The first thing I show you is personal income tax as a share of GDP, off the left-hand axis, rising out of the difficult 1970s. As the economic recovery takes off from the late 90s and 2000s, the burden on the individual falls. The bump there is the global financial crisis. But post-crisis, as the growth rate falls away, the burden on the individual income taxpayer rises again, reflecting the pattern that we last saw coming out of the late 1970s. A position forced on the country by corporate tax receipts as a share of GDP that will peak into 2007. But never recover out of the financial crisis. And arguably, if we'd followed other emerging markets to grow out of the crisis from 2012 or 13, this indicator should have picked up again to about that point, while the personal income tax number fell through it, forming an X effect. What we see in the corporate tax picture reflects what we see in the budget deficit. The ANC comes to power with deficits of around negative 5%. And 13 years later, we'll record a budget surplus for the first time. But all that hard work, pain and suffering now wasted, and deficits again plumb levels that were last seen at the end of apartheid. National revenue as a share of GDP, now off the right-hand axis, continues to increase in pursuit of levels of national expenditure as a share of GDP that are at an all-time record high point. Never before has the South African government extracted this much wealth out of households and corporates in order to finance its policy objectives, and the point of diminishing returns is far behind us. I briefed one of the banks a week ago, and at this point I said the point of no return is far behind us, and the bank executives felt they'd made a serious mistake in getting this chap to come and talk to their senior clients. I told them it's not that bad yet. It's diminishing returns. No returns is somewhere over here. It's not sufficient, and that's debt to GDP. ANC inherited that at around 48% in 1994. They'll cut that in half. It will be 26% by 2007. But it's run away number now, and debt to GDP now exceeds what was recorded at the end of the apartheid era. Much of the initial success of the ANC in government probably related to the closing budget deficit against falling debt levels, as saving on the government's interest bill here alone would have been sufficient to finance the initial rollout of the social grants program. So the trouble that this causes for government policy makers, the extent of the trouble cannot be underestimated. The trouble's not just in the country, it comes now also from global headwinds. In May of 2017, 662 Rand was the price of a barrel of Brent crude oil. By May of 2018, that number was 50% higher at 970. Keep the Rand, I said this was done a few weeks ago, if the Rand gets to 15 to the dollar, now at 15.50, and oil at 90 to the barrel, that's another 50% increase in one of the key input costs necessary to stage an economic recovery. If the global headwinds can be seen off, then we turn back to the domestic ones, the most formidable of which is what is happening in our country's schools. We estimate that in 2014 in grade 10, that's the old standard 8, there were just over 1 million pupils in the class, 1.1 million. And 2 years later, they'd become the matric class of 2016, but only 610,000 of them were there. 400,000 of the original cohort would pass matric, 162,000 nominally well enough to go to university, but at standards so low that they're meaningless for any analysis. 33,000 kids passed maths in matric with a grade of 60% or higher. And that's a really important benchmark, because if you give that to the chaps who write our survey work on education, they'll tell you a lot about what's going to happen in the rest of that guy's life. Regardless of his circumstances, he'll go to university, get a fairly reasonable qualification, be employed in the formal sector, become successful and join the middle classes, and if he comes out of a poor background, do a lot to uplift his family. If he does not have that qualification, his prospects are very much worse, let alone the chaps that didn't even appear on this graphic, because they were part of the 50% of kids that don't make it through the last 2 years of high school, 40% passing, 15% university passes, 3 in 100 South African children. Meeting their expectations for a better life in the era of the Ramaphosa administration is going to be very, very difficult. Quite how difficult? We start to see on this graphic. Since 2001, and not 11 as my heading suggests, we think that the working age population increased by 9.3 million people. But of those, only 3 million we estimate were absorbed into employment, 1.5 million still looking for jobs, and half of entrants ultimately dropped out of the labour market, sitting on the side of the road, waiting for something to happen. Third absorbed, 15% still looking, half sitting on the side of the road. Only amongst graduate professionals does South Africa have a labour market absorption rate that competes with other emerging markets or developed economies. And even at the official rate of unemployment that understates the problem, our rate is roughly 3 times higher than that of any other part of the world that we would care to compare ourselves to. And if you think there's some relationship between this 50% and the kids who aren't getting through their last 2 years of high school, we'd agree with you. We think in the main we're talking about the same people. That's become a political problem. This was done in December of last year. The question was asked of people, how do you feel about political parties? For people under the age of 24, 40%, the red ones, said they feel good about the African National Congress, and 20% said they feel good about some other political party. Add them together, 20 and 40, we have 60, missing the 40% of people who said they wouldn't tell us how they feel about political parties. But it doesn't matter, because move the needle to the first generation with living memory experience of apartheid, people aged 45 and above, and the data changes completely. Get a 20 percentage point high level of sympathy for the ANC. And what that is people who appreciate the extent to which their lives are better than they were 25 years ago. That remains the primary driver of ANC voting support. The idea that ANC voters somehow just vote for the ANC because that's what they do, we don't think is the case. And it's a story we think arises out of this idea that took hold, that service delivery in the main was a failure and the country no better off than it was in 1985. It's substantially better off. And the political result you see over here. But this much lower level of trust in the ANC is skepticism. And we don't see how that skepticism can be addressed other than through absorbing young people into the labour market. As a temporary measure, you can use political incitement and racial nationalist fervour as a proxy for jobs and a better life. But it doesn't last very long. And when the people realise they've been had, this Achilles heel is something that can do severe damage to the ruling party. There is one terribly powerful countervailing force in favour of our long-term success, and it's something that very few analysts have access to, as some can't afford to produce the information and others pretend that it's not real. But it's the good sense of the great majority of South Africa's people. Social media and what happens on Twitter does not reflect our polling of deep public opinion in the country. And where remarkably enough, we think that for the history of the country, the current inequalities, the difficult past decade, the degree of political incitement, 8 out of 10 South Africans remain moderate, middle-of-the-road people who believe in the same things and understand that the same policies will ultimately deliver success. Around September of last year, we asked the question, do you believe, the whole question reads something along the lines that South Africans of different race and class groups need to work together if each group is to realise its potential in a future South Africa, and 84% of people said that they agreed with that. The difference between rich and poor and black and white is very little. It's sort of 82s to 86s. University students have caused immense damage to their institutions, both their reputations and the physical infrastructure. And we asked people, students, you really care? Is it very important that your university lecturer is the same race as yourself? And less than 1 in 10 students said that that was the case for them. The likelihood is that the campuses were held hostage by minority opinion that intimidated other students into going along. Without prompting an answer, we asked what South Africa's greatest unresolved problem is. And 56% of people said jobs, the thing they say that will do more than anything else to improve circumstances in the community that I come from. And this fourth point mustn't be misconstrued. It's not a question of whether restitution is important. It's a question that's asked about whether land reform is the best way to improve your own life. In other words, do you want to go back to the land because it offers you the best option at a better life? And 1.5% of people say that's important to them. Restitution's a different question. But the idea that there is massive popular demand for land, and if land is released to people, the country will calm down, failing which we'll have some sort of revolution, is not something borne out by the polling that we've done over a number of years. For all the common sense that probably and common goodwill that rests within the country, the social fabric strained but holding up, we don't think that the ANC is going to move towards structural reform, neither for the fact that there might be support for it or the fact that the party is in such terrible trouble. And the reason why the ANC won't move towards reform anytime soon is what you see over here. Between 2004 and 2009, the ANC saw a net loss of 15 seats in Parliament. The splinter, the Congress of the People, got 30, almost double the net gain of the Democratic Alliance. Between the next two elections, 2009 and 14, the pattern is repeated. The ANC suffers a net loss of a further 14 seats, and this time it's the splinter, the EFF, what at 25, is 3 above the net gain of the Democratic Alliance. Test the same idea at local government level, and between 2011 and 16, and use votes and numbers as the indicator, the ANC suffered a loss of 500,000 voters. The DA's net gain was 1.6 million, 800,000 short of what was received by the economic freedom fighters. And if you're an ANC strategist, you can come to the conclusion, and you might be right, that your short-term political future faces a far greater threat, not from the political opposition, particularly given the state of the opposition, but from yourself. And that unity is important now above all else. The end of the Zuma decade, ANC support levels might not have fallen terribly far if you factor in that 54% for the ANC in the 2016 local poll saw them lose 8 that went to the EFF at that back, and the ANC stays where it is. But the damage done by Zuma to the ANC was its internal unity. Vavi and Saftu have gone off in one direction, Malema's gone off in another. The Communist Party threatened to walk out. They couldn't do it. They'd get very few votes indeed. But the party splintered. And if you want to get through the immediate period ahead, you have to unite. And if you want to unite, you can't do structural reform, because to do structural reform, you've got to talk about ideology and governance, two factors that will tear the organisation apart. So for the time being, and you must see the strategic sense in it to understand the ANC, the prospects of any firm moves towards reform, we think are very limited. If you think that's complacent for the ANC, you might be wrong. This done a few months ago, we're now busy as we speak with the most expansive political polling we've ever done. And we should within 6 weeks be in a position, my polling chap says I mustn't say that, but to call the result within a percentage point or two. But done a couple of months ago, if there'd been an election, the smaller parties would have had 7. The DA knocked back to 20 from where it stood before. The EFF under 10, consistent with our thesis that mainstream opinion is moderate and middle of the road. The ANC at 60, which shouldn't surprise, because even late last year, we'd have put them in the high 50s and kept them there for 2019, even with Mr. Zuma as their leader, with 5 undecideds leaning towards the ANC. Failing a complete disaster, another Marikana triggering some sort of social uprising, a terrible economic collapse, the ANC should walk through the next election with a majority of around 60% and perhaps more than that. Factor in the odds that the EFF may return. We've said from day one the EFF is not an opposition party. It's a franchise of the ANC established under protest and exile, and it will return when it has negotiated a balance of power outside the party, the balance of which was gifted to it by the DA in the keys to Port Elizabeth, Johannesburg and Pretoria. And we might end up within a year from now in the very strange position where the ANC collective, whatever reunification might mean, will have a greater national majority than it's ever presided over, at a point when the country is in more economic and political and social trouble than it has been since the late 1980s. We therefore think we know a few things, and before we take the turn into 2030. We think our country did far better than it's ever been given credit for, but that much of that progress related to the first decade or so, 12 or 13 years after 1994. In 2007, that progress was interrupted. The result was that confidence in the future fell away very quickly, popular frustrations increased, the protests took off, and under pressure the ANC began to break into pieces. At the same time, it was running out of money, and the fear of one day surrendering fiscal sovereignty to an international financing institution, matched with the fear that they might be the first liberation movement in continental Southern Africa to come to power through armed struggle ever to surrender power again, brought them to their conference at Nasrec last year, where by a margin of 179 votes out of 4,700 delegates, Mr. Ramaphosa became leader of the ANC, meaning that if 90 people had voted differently, then Dr. Dlamini Zuma would have delivered the State of the Nation address earlier this year. Remove Mr. Ramaphosa, and what sits behind him looks remarkably like the infrastructure that grew through the era of Jacob Zuma, both in terms of the crooks and the thugs, and the left-wing ideologues who did such incredible damage in parallel with state capture to engineer the crisis we find ourselves at today. Despite that, and still being there, and despite Mr. Ramaphosa's narrow majority, the ANC's pursuit of unity will probably be successful It will win the next election with a majority of 60% plus, and it will form a cabinet, the decisions of which determines what happens to all of us. Are the long game theorists right? And is Mr. Ramaphosa slowly isolating his opponents and putting together the mandate that he'll need to move firmly after the election in the direction of structural reform, positioning our country as a far more competitive investment destination? Or is that naive? And will we suffer through a further decade of structural deterioration? While that plays itself out, the battle of ideas, do we remain a fundamentally free and open society? Or does the populist pressure see an erosion of civil rights to the point that a decade from now, South Africa is governed by a far more authoritarian administration? How those decisions are made give us direction, the most intriguing of which remains for us top left, the scenario we call the rise of the right. What happens here will be somewhere along these lines. Populist pressure will be used to undermine civil rights protections and the like, constitutional safeguards. And the state becoming more authoritarian, frightened at the prospect of later surrendering control if it can't meet popular expectations, will use its growing authority not to oppress its people, but to force unpopular, conservative structural reforms, positioning South Africa as a far more competitive investment destination. It's an anathema to South Africans given the experience of recent decades, but it's the only model that's made poor countries rich since the end of the Second World War. It's Lee Kuan Yew, it's Park in Korea, it's Deng in China. It's under different circumstances, the Rwandans and the efforts of Haile Mariam Desalegn in Ethiopia. Shot the student protesters in the streets, but maintains growth rates 7% of GDP. We become an African tiger, a play on the Asian experience. Closeness to China becomes the financier where some finance is required. And the marker of all of it is one of the key markers of the Asian tiger experience, that pragmatism has ultimately trumped ideology, setting up a growth and investment recovery. It's intriguing, but it's dangerous, because we could easily end up with this one without the structural reform, meaning that we are on the verge of walking into the waiting arms of the tyranny of the left. What happens here is that populist ideology will develop a momentum of its own. It will trump all pragmatism in the end. Property rights rapidly eroded to assuage public anger, setting up the later erosion of civil rights, given that the former anchors the latter in all free and open societies. This sort of constructive closeness to China will be replaced by a closeness to pariah states, massive economic deterioration. We show you the data in a few minutes. And all of it buttressed by destructive racial nationalism, that devastating phrase that set up the collapse of so many promising countries, that if you oppose all of this, you are an enemy of the people. We were described earlier today as an enemy of the people by an author in some publication. If you've seen us over the past decade, you'll know that we tend to lean, if you push us, towards this one, what we call the breakup of South Africa. The strange coincidence, sort of a twilight zone between structural deterioration in a country that in many respects remains a fundamentally free one, in the sense that it doesn't have an authoritarian government. The politics is contested, as we see now, within and between parties. Political instability rises. Policy contradictions are the key marker of the breakup. We announce an expropriation package and a stimulus package on the same evening in the same speech. That must be some sort of record. The result of that is not complete collapse into the horrors of Venezuela, but that a relative economic underperformance becomes the status quo. And whether it's on employment or growth rates or whatever the case is, South Africa performs at 20% or 25% of emerging market norms. The middle classes ultimately get fed up with this. They lose confidence in the state and they take upon themselves many of the functions of the state. South Africa fragments into what we call an enclave society, ultimately 5 or 6 or 7 million people living in walled villages, their money offshore, working mainly for themselves and as entrepreneurs for clients here and around the world, mainly in the services economy, maintaining a Western middle class standard of living in seas of relative poverty. Many of the enclaves will look like the cliche of the Rainbow Nation, but with a wall around it to keep the nation out. And South Africa's taken a completed the circle essentially back to where we started in the 1990s. Largely unequal society, the small, prosperous middle class, but that middle class will be largely integrated. We hawks and have a hawkish reputation, and that served us very well over many years. But our critics now say we are too harsh, and that we are already in the early stages of the scenario that they call the rise of the rainbow. What happens here is Mr. Ramaphosa has a popular mandate for structural reform. We agree that he probably does have that amongst people. Popularity polling done in December showed that his points lead over his then rival Dr. Dlamini Zuma sat somewhere between 20 and 30 points, an extraordinary lead. And if he led South Africa in the direction of structural reform, he would win broad popular support. That reform would see the anti-investment hostility dissipate, the rule of law very strongly in evidence, the private sector freed to lead an economic recovery, and all the important indicators are moving in the right direction. The long game theorist's view now is that it's not upon us right at this moment, but let Mr. Ramaphosa get through the election with a 60% mandate, and he will surprise his critics and show that he's been a reformer all along. What's life like in each of these worlds? If we go top left, the rise of the right, and you stand in that future in 2030 and you were to ask a university student to write you a paper summing up what had characterized South Africa's past decade, his summation would include these terms quite prominently. An authoritarian capitalist state where pragmatism trumped ideology, setting up a growth and investment recovery. The markers to watch for on the way to that are these four, starting with initially unpopular reforms to labour market and deployment policy. Pull that trajectory off over the next decade, and we think that South Africa's data will probably stack up something like this. 2018 to 2030, the unemployment rate, the official rate, more than cut in half. The ANC comfortably in the mid-60s in terms of its electoral support, all made possible by the economic recovery that was built on the mandate the party got in the 2019 election, as our growth rate, global circumstances allowing, fights its way up to levels of between 5 and 6%. It can also go very wrong though. Let the popular sentiment develop too much of a life of its own, where it becomes unstoppable and the pragmatism is excised from policy making, and we can get ourselves into very severe trouble, setting up a real erosion of civil rights and an economic collapse. The key markers will start with a hasty introduction, actioning of hostile and counterproductive policy. The results taken to their extremes, 2018 to 2030, we think we could double our unemployment rate. The ANC, hugely unpopular, but clinging to power through its control of the institutions that could remove it from power, all on the back of South Africa slipping into a decade-deep recession, perhaps a recession prompted further by global circumstances turning very sharply against us in this 2019-2021 period. And you must have no doubt that this is now possible for us, and we can find ourselves there a decade from now. If it remains the breakup, what will have happened is that there will have been no firm moves towards reform. The politics will have remained messy and contested within and between parties, political instability rising, and policy will remain an utter contradiction. The markers, the state continuing to present that inconsistent and contradictory policy, much more aggressive signs of fragmentation and enclave formation, and we underperform our EM peers on whatever you want to compare us to. 2018 to 2030, unemployment rate bounces along at its current level, and if I showed you the line for the past 5 or 6 years, it looks almost exactly like that. It's in this one that the ANC will lose an election. It's a free and open society that cannot meet the expectations of the people in the country, and the ANC is ultimately defeated, setting up a new era of coalition politics. Coalition partners will simply contribute to the contested politics and the contradictory policy. The ANC with 60% couldn't pull off a policy reformation. The coalition partners, when you think who they're likely to be, will find it even more difficult. Growth looks volatile, but we just let that bounce around between 1 and 2% if global circumstances allow, and if they don't, just pull the growth number somewhere beneath the 0% mark. But looking at South Africa here in the macro perspective will be a mistake. Like leopard spots across the map will be the enclave standing out more and more clearly, and they, if you cut them out, would amongst them show some of the most exciting emerging markets anywhere in the world. And then there's this, the prospect that the long game theorists are right, that Mr. Ramaphosa is a master strategist. He's found himself in a terribly difficult position, and he simply needs the time to slowly isolate his opponents and gather that strong electoral mandate in order to drive reformation. The markers after the next election, I'm afraid we'll have to wait this time. The swift action on the investment hurdles and disincentives, setting up the other 3 markers, the net result of which unemployment to sub 20%, not as far as the rise of the right, because you don't have the same authoritarian state able to trample all over trade unions and labour laws and minimum wages and the like. The ANC in the mid-60 percentiles on the back of the rising living standards of its core supporter base, all of it made possible by Mr. Ramaphosa's long game, gaining momentum and pushing South African growth to between 5 and 6%. We don't think there's a 5th scenario, and the future will fall within the confines of one of the 4. There's more than enough information around to know exactly which of the 4 that's going to be, with a significant amount of advanced warning. And no one sitting here should be in a position where anything happens in our long-term future that takes you by surprise. And I stop talking and invite your questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, Kansan first. I see one at the back and I see one in the front, but we'll do one at a time.
What's the possibility of Zuma actually spinning up a separate party? Yeah, what's the possibility of Jacob Zuma spinning up his own political party?
The question is Zuma and his own political party. I've been to Natal, I've spoken to a few people. I think it's unlikely that it will gain much traction at all. So I'd be surprised if it was to happen in a manner that it had generated any real success. I think Zuma's best position is to threaten splintering the ANC. 20% of the ANC vote will come out of Natal next time round. So if that's in doubt and the ANC is at 60, that pushes them into the mid-50s, setting up the disaster that struck the ANC in Gauteng in 2014 when they slipped 10 percentage points and didn't see it coming. And I think Mr. Zuma's game will be to threaten and to say, if you leave me alone, I leave you alone. But if you push me into a corner, I'm going to retaliate. And I might just cause for you a very serious problem. Anthony's question.
So the editorial in the Business Day today said, Zuma's, Ramaphosa's displaying all these populist tendencies. So you would argue that that's potentially part of his long game to keep it together. That's the one question, comment. And the other question is, are you ever going to get to show this sort of thing to Cabinet?
Anthony, I told you that there are analysts who say it's part of Ramaphosa's long game. They might be right, but I'm unconvinced. I don't think there is a game, a game that leads to reform. If there is a game, it's the wrong game. And if it's a long game, it's the wrong kind of game, because what we need desperately is a short game. And I'm unconvinced by the view that Ramaphosa is paralyzed and cannot move. If he wanted to, he's got the authority to appoint a proper director of public prosecutions, to quietly instruct that man to arrest these 15 people. NPA prosecutors say that that 15 get 15 years in prison, each of them. They'll never even get bail. That power play will unite the party because no one will dare to go against him. It's too big a job to try and sift out all the corrupt out of the current NEC. So you stick with me. I won't let the prosecutors visit you. And on the back of that, to introduce the necessary reforms to position South Africa as a more competitive economy. I think he's got the ability to do that. I think he's got the power. I think at the momentum into the third week of January and into early February. I think it's been wasted, but I will be open to the analysts who argue that point with me and say you're wrong, he's paralyzed, he can't move. It's always a long game. He will slowly, through his state capture inquiry and slowly through the NPA, isolate the opponents, and he will surprise you on the upside come the middle of next year.
Will you present this to government?
Yeah, we do. We do. I see Sebastian Shatov, then I see, I missed the third one. Let's take that one.
You've spoken about the possible end of the Judeo-Christian ethic.
Right.
You've received a lot of flack for that. So what do you actually mean by that, and what is your response?
Well, one of the responses is which ethic would people prefer to live under? Because those people who live under the Judeo-Christian ethic tend to live in societies where you're free to say what you want. The state doesn't drag you away in the middle of the night. Journalists are free to act. So we don't see the problem with it. And we're not surprised at the critique. We think the critique comes out of the hard left and shows the extent to which hard left sentiment can in some quarters prevail in the face of the evidence and in the face of complete common sense. It was a deliberately provocative comment that we made to see what reaction it would elicit, and we weren't entirely surprised by the reaction itself.
Why don't you say an individual freedom and moral rights ethic? Why bring religion into it?
We do say that most of the time. I'd say 99 times out of 100. We also a group that likes to push boundaries and make strong statements, and we made an intentionally strong statement to see what reaction we'd elicit. And we elicited the reaction we anticipated. I see two at the back and then Sebastian, the lady.
Hi, thank you. The data always talks the truth. Just a question, just look at this audience. So I'm an MBA student. I want to eventually do my PhD in behavioral economics. Long road ahead, but that's really where I want to be. Just to look at this particular segment of the audience and comparing how much of your lectures and your knowledge and data that you share with the young, so 18 to 25 to 30, 35 age group at universities in entry-level professional employment that are going to influence the sentiment, which is so key, of the populace of South Africa. And do you get invited to talk to the marginalized of society? And then also your comment on, I don't know whether you've read the Yan Malan's book on the forthcoming election. Eusebius McCarthy presented very well when it was launched. I'd just like to get your insight on that. Sure. Is it also, I asked the same question around sentiment and how much that plays. You shared insight on that, and I'm glad that you did. But just some insights, because I think we tend to have a biased view that this is the representation of our world. It's not the real world. It's not the whole world. So I'd like to get your feedback on the world that we may not actually always get to see.
I think we make a very real effort to get out there. And I travel an immense amount, and I've seen places and parts of the country that I didn't know were there. And we try to provoke invitations to whatever constituency or audience would like to see us. In the main, we talk to the middle classes, but we do a reasonable number of briefings a year, right through the social strata, and universities are one that we particularly enjoy. They've been a bit volatile in recent years. The main way we talk, though, is not through briefings. We place a great volume of opinion in the media. This year to date, I think my media colleagues tell me 11 citations a day. And that allows you to reach literally hundreds of thousands of people every day.
Does that include social media?
Yeah, in the extent that we work on other people's social media platforms. It's still the case, if you get into the mainstream online media and you get into the top 10 storylines and you stay there for a couple of hours, you will reach hundreds of thousands of people either directly or through those platforms using their social media. But the broader point, I agree with you completely, that many think tanks become inwardly focused. They hold seminars and talk to each other. And the converted are very important because they're never quite as loyal as you thought. And just when you thought they've gone off somewhere else. So you do have to preach to the converted because they become the disciples that take the message out into the rest of the world. But we've made enormous efforts to communicate outwards into the rest of the world and to sell the message to people who consume news media. And what happens then is the person who consumes news media tends to be the person who influences the discussions in their social circles. So you don't need everyone in a community reading you. You need the chap who reads reading you. And you can be fairly confident that that evening, wherever he finds himself, if a question comes up, he might make or reflect on some of the points that you've been able to make to him.
Sorry, I don't mean to be selfish, but just on the point of the 18 to 25 year age group, where the last labour force market survey, the 67% unemployment between 18 to 25. The conversations are not revolving around this stuff. They're revolving around where can I get my next bit of airtime. So is there some hope to get broader level of understanding to get that unity that we need in that fastest segment of the growing population?
I'm unsure what the conversation is. I mean, the best I do is to look into the polling and to see what people say and think. And sometimes at first you feel it will be a frightening experience, but it's actually a very encouraging one, because you see in poor social strata of young people an immense amount of common sense. And I think if you speak to that common sense and speak up to it, not down to it, I think that you're doing what you can to influence the views and opinions that those young people may hold. Ultimately, the winner of all these, what we fight here is a battle of ideas. And the winner of the battle of ideas is the side that entered the greatest amount of compelling argument into the public domain at the point of crisis. And those opinions, if they've been taken on board in the run-up to the crisis, have a very good chance of influencing the policy framework that follows the crisis. And the crisis is near. The way we are headed, we're going to get ourselves into serious trouble. But that is the inflection point, the point where reform becomes possible. And we've, for that reason, invested a vast amount of money and people in talking outwards into the public domain. And to the point where we will now confidently say we reach several 100,000 people every day. And beyond that, I don't know how much more you can do to determine what people will ultimately think or believe. You show them the evidence and you trust in them. You asked me about Jan Hubert's book. I thought it was fine. I thought the idea was right, maybe a bit early on the call, but ultimately, if we remain a free and open society, a coalition world will be upon us if structural reform is delayed. There were two next to you, and then I moved back to the front.
What impact do you think an economic a global economic downturn would have on your scenarios? Would that be a marker for any one of the scenarios?
Yeah, we get absolutely smashed because we went into the last global crisis growing at 5% with a budget surplus, debt levels cut in half. We're going to this one with our pants down, and it's going, and we will. It will risk either a very difficult version of bottom right, where the elites survive in enclaves, political and economic. The cabinet members will be your neighbours, or if popular sentiment is harnessed to the worsening economic circumstances, there is nothing about us in terms of our place in the world, or who we are, the resources we have, the people, the government, to say that we cannot be a Venezuela. So we must understand that the risk is there. And if you want to be one, court this socialist rhetoric in an environment when there's great uncertainty about global economic circumstances and you're toying with the risk. Sorry, I'm very bad at this. I see Sebastian number 1, and then I see 1, 2 to my left.
Frans, of the 4 scenarios that you presented, do you have a system of rating the likelihood of which? And or perhaps what is your personal opinion on the likelihood of the top 2?
The Financial Times a few years ago wrote a wonderful editorial under the headline, "A Track Record of Complete Failure," which they used to describe the global forecasting industry. And I will answer your question after a warning, and you must disregard the answer. Why don't we not just come here and tell you? There are lots of us, we data, we track these things, you know some of our colleagues, clever people. The reason is we're not nearly good enough to do that for you. The Shell scenario planning team in the 1960s and 70s got the Shell board to anticipate the oil price spike of 1973. And they did that by dispensing completely with traditional ways of looking at the future and saying there isn't a single official future, a single point in future space and time. There are plural futures. There's more than one, a plural concept. And we must be open to all of them. Writing later on their success in the Harvard Business Review, a leader of their team, Pierre Wack, who'd later trained the team at Anglo-American here, said that the answer to failures in forecasting is not to hire better forecasters, but to change completely the method we use to look at the future. Later, I think that generation understood instinctively that single point forecasting was risky. And Wack said the risk was particularly severe because forecasts are usually right. But he said they're only right, the leader of the Shell team, because the world they're based on hasn't yet changed. When the world changes profoundly, the moment that the forecast would have been really useful, it has no use at all. And the firm that relied on it goes back into the strategy environment amidst the chaos of change. He said dispense with that idea, plan for alternative futures, and respond to them and use uncertainty to take a lead on your competitors. You're hearing my Free State opening lecture. Later, complex systems theory will produce the proof that small changes in the present conditions of complex systems bring about such huge shifts in their future circumstances that forecasting a complex system cannot ever succeed, can't be done. You are best off out of a briefing like this, if you're using it to make strategy, to treat each of these as equally plausible. And if you struggle with that, that's why we tell the story of from P.W. Botha to Martinus van Schalkwyk in 10 years. American civil rights activists in America in the 1960s told that there will be a black man in the White House within 40 years, let alone to telling the occupant of the White House that your successor will be Donald Trump. You are best off understanding that each of these can happen and wind tunneling yourself against each of them. If this has happened, what has happened to me? And if one of them wipes you out, you are gambling with your future in the country. If you get through them all in reasonable shape, given that some of them are harsh, you're very robustly positioned to deal with the world. That said, our advice being take them all seriously. I feel that we don't have the civil service or the Confucian ethic that was central to the success of the rise of the right model. I am unconvinced that the long game theorists are right, but I'm open to the fact that they might be. So I tend to play this one down as well. I think the odds are around good 50% that we're going to end up in some sort of enclave future with a very difficult environment around us. We're different to the 50s, 60s and 70s of post-colonial Africa in that the option to create an enclave now exists. And I think that option has already been taken by a great many people if you look around the country, or when I'm invited to sort of tour the Gulf estates of the Cape Southern Coast. It's as if they've declared independence. They say, don't say that, they will come for us. So I think the odds are about sitting about 40 to 50% over here. Put 20 to or so percent in here, because we are not far away from that now. And split the difference between these two up here. And if this was a pry, that's what I'd tell you. But serious advice is to take them all seriously and don't let any of them take you by surprise. They carry very near degrees of plausibility between them, as difficult as it is to see. There was one there, then I see the hand behind me, then I see the lady in blue. Yes, sir. Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll try and remember that. Yes.
I read in, I think it was BizNews, I think it was this morning or yesterday, Alec Hogg was, he's always been behind this sort of long game theory. And I think it was this morning, yesterday, he was talking about how he's sort of going for the sort of maybe turning of the left or breakup theory, because apparently Ramaphosa was quoting Mao Zedong in China recently and talking about how all the socialist countries must unite and things like that. So, do you have a comment?
Yeah, we're not sure what to make of Ramaphosa. He might be a reformer playing a very sophisticated long game, but an increasingly odd one, that you need a recession in order to launch a reformation. Maybe he's a chameleon and takes on the attributes of the environment around him, in the same way that his erstwhile trade union colleagues were dismayed at his role in business. So in private, his erstwhile business colleagues expressed dismay at his role in government. We're not sure what to make of him and what he is. It's difficult to nail that down. Zuma was nailed down very quickly for us. We got him right from the get-go. He was best described by Peter Bruce, Zuma, as a man who never heard an idea he did not like. I see the left and then the lady, yes.
Just to ask about the way you see the metros going. If you look at the way Cape Town started from just Cape Town, the DA spreading, better governance, better rule of law. Gauteng's going that way. I mean, just look at the last election. Could that have an effect going forward? I mean, Cape Town, generally, people say it's better run.
Almost ran out of water as well. I think the Cape is unique because a lot of Cape voters changed their allegiance. A lot of Cape voters voted NP, ANC, DA. They move around based on where their interests seem to be most. They're not the most loyal voter base, would appear to me. I'm not a great expert on these things. So maybe the Cape for the DA is fairly secure for the time being. It doesn't have much by way of majority control in any of the others, and governs at the pleasure of the EFF. And possibly it's a very tough decision if you were Musi Maimane at the time, but in handing Malema the power to give the cities back to the ANC, did you give him the key to the deputy presidency of the ANC as well? And might you have been better off, and this is absolutely second guessing, Musi was in the job, and his other colleagues. Might you have been better off saying to the ANC and the EFF, no, in fact, you guys have a go, and see what the result of that might have been. But I would not be surprised if after this election the EFF was to give back those cities to the ANC. Whether it can retain them 2 years later is another question. Because remember, after this election, we're going to another one in 2 years' time. And that's the one that the ANC is really in trouble in, because that's a local one where it always does badly. And it will be contesting that one 2 years after, if we are right in the main here, doing really nothing about improving people's standards of living. It's also why we say, we're getting this view a lot in the sort of banking world that or investment world, if Cyril gets 60%, then reform will happen because the pressure will be off him. He'll be under more political pressure. If you think the fear of losing an election prompts populism, the pending local election will really do that. So I think the DA might surrender some of the north of the country that it's temporarily controlled. It's also been through a tough time. It's that thing said of the Israelis and the Palestinians, never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity, is something that seems to be playing out in the DA. But they've made one or two good hires recently. And if those hires get in the game, then the prospect for the DA turning its fortunes around is certainly there. And then if reform does not materialize, the DA's prospects going into the next local election might be quite good. The lady in blue.
Is that me?
That's you.
Oh, God. That's embarrassing. It's France, eh?
That's me.
It's my first time here, so everybody please forgive me, because I'm going to probably have a lot of this and none of that. So thank you for being here. I'm just really concerned. As I look around, no disrespect to everybody or anybody here, I look at the age group. Like I said, it's very difficult what you're saying for it to penetrate a mind that is sort of polarized from a different age. I'm trying to be polite. Old geezers are very difficult to reform. People that sit on boards who make decisions for the next generation who don't really understand on-ground situation, be it black, white, green, purple, or orange, are just difficult to penetrate. I focus on the breakup here, and we are already there as far as I'm concerned. We can dance around the tyranny, the rise of the rainbow, and the rise of the right as much as we want. We might find pockets of people like that in the audience today. But as far as I'm concerned, we are literally facing the breakup. And as you sit here speaking to all of us, and I sit and listen to you succinctly, and I think you're speaking to an old, tired choir. They absolutely do not want to change. They absolutely listen to you in order to make a profit tomorrow, not any other time, but literally to wake up, look at the stock exchange, to make their money, not an impact. It doesn't matter. So I have to ask you this. As you speak to this audience, how contagious do you think it is? And if so, what percentage of it, and where is it ultimately going to penetrate into society? I say that because 10 years from now, 90% of this audience is not going to be here. Sorry. And if you're relying on them to take this message, or even the debate, to their counterparts, their children, their grandkids, you can freaking forget it. So, your outreach, besides this, it's my first time here. It's this foundation I came. In reality, you sit and you outline facts about what is, without an opinion. And I watched you very carefully. And that you're very careful not to have an opinion. You're simply saying, as an analyst of some sort, you're saying, these are the facts. Take whatever you can and leave what you have to leave behind. And I respect that. But I don't know if the audience here is responsible enough to take that forward in order for it to be meaningful past drinking wine and having lovely cheese.
I'd say to you that I get around a lot and have done so over many years. And presented, we try to tot it up probably a couple of thousand of these briefings. On top of the media hits that my group's able to get. And I'm not sure that you're right.
I'm not trying to be right.
No, I'm not sure that you're right. I'm struck more often by how people react to these scenarios in a similar way. If you talk to a political audience, if you talk to government officials, talk to the opposition, talk to some university crowds, some of them are tough crowds to talk to, how ultimately they come to the same conclusions. They seem to be disappointed about the same failures. And that, which I do have to back me up with, is pretty much in line with a lot of the opinion polling that we do. That there is a great degree of common ground across race, class, income and age lines about what is wrong and what a better country would look like. So if me at the end, and I'm the hawkish analyst, remember, if at the end of this experience that I've had, and I make an express effort to get to far-flung corners of the world, and next week I'm in places with the very small places talking. If my experience at the end of that has not to become cynical and to say that public opinion can never take this message forward, regardless of where it is, then I think that's a pretty good test and benchmark for the fact that I said it intentionally, that the most powerful countervailing force in favour of our long-term success is the common ground that exists between the great majority of people. Very often in an audience, younger people will say they don't believe the other side has it. Some business audiences have denied that it could possibly be true, that there are senior ANC leaders who want to go in a direction other than a bottom left. Some of the more militant white right has been surprised to hear that the black left didn't just want to wipe them out completely. So I retain that, and I think it's true of us, and I think it's probably the one thing that has got South Africa out of a great deal of trouble before, but I'm not complacent about it. And if this time it doesn't translate into real reform, there's no guarantee that that common ground will remain the case for us.
What do you mean? Sorry, what do you mean this time?
Well, we faced crises over so many decades. And each time we've hit a crisis that's meant to have wiped us out. I remember once a younger analyst, we had a lunch for some businessmen. And they talked about things were going wrong. And the one chap who was in the lunch with us, who was a well-known public figure in business, older then. That was 10 years ago, and I think he is still alive, so he's made it. He said, you know, he's heard this all before. He said he remembers in 1948 when the Greek greengrocer came to see his father and said the Greeks will have to leave because it's the end now. And he remembers Sharpeville in 1976 and the Rubicon speech and the transition and the referendum and the election in 94. And at each point, he said it was the end. And the one thing he said he'd learnt, and this was such a memorable lunch, he said that because of the people, the country just plods along. And despite its government, it gets through. Now that's a very dangerous idea because it can breed complacency. And we can think, well, they can do anything, we get through. This time, I hope that remains the case. But it's the people. If there is a difference between us and Venezuela and so on, it's that the people have had the advance warning and have had the position to respond and react to the early signs that unchecked, the trajectory we're on at the moment can get us into a great degree of trouble, and simply withdrawing from the society might offer one, this time round, some prospect of a comfortable life. If you drive down those Gulf estates of the Cape South Coast, Very difficult to see how they won't be there in 10 or 20 years' time. But to live in them, you'll have to shut yourself off from the rest of the world and pretend it doesn't exist. And there might be some people who are able to do that. But on the whole, people I've come across in this job that I do would have found that difficult to do. I had hands. I know the one at the back's been very persistent.
Maybe as a start, I'd just like to say that there's a truism that only the good die young. So I'm sure many of us will be around. In terms of your scenario planning, do you think possibly that Ramaphosa is playing the same game of going through what's appropriate at certain times and then to move to different strategies? Like where he is now, unity is I think for even a casual observer, it's obvious that it's necessary. Do you think he'll chameleon, you mentioned the word earlier, after that into different position, different strategy?
I'm open to it, as I said, and I'm open to the long game theorists being right. They might be right. I'm unconvinced though, still. And I agree in unity, but there are many ways. It's like this question of land reform. Yes, restitution is the right thing to do, but expropriation is definitely not the way to get there. And unity in the ANC is essential. But imagine you'd locked up everyone from the deputy president on down, and they were sitting in prison today. How the ANC would have united around Ramaphosa with that power. And he would have been a very strong character, very much in charge. And he would do exceptionally well in drawing support, not just out of his own dissatisfied base, but from across the spectrum. Exactly the same way he did in those early days when he jogged down the promenade in Cape Town or flew in Kulula. And what I don't buy is that this was the only option for unity. And there's a risk, and even if it is a strategic option, you must remember who his opponents are. Mr. Mabuza and Mr. Malema are shrewd strategists, and if you play a long game with them, there's no telling who comes out of that game on top at the end. I see one in front of me and then 1, 2, 3 at the back. I'll try and remember. Yes, sir.
You have this one slide where you showed different age groups, and you basically showed that the younger group had less support for the ANC versus the plus 45s, and seeing that the life expectancy is an important question anyway, wouldn't that mean that over time the ANC loses more percentage, yet you're showing that they will still stay in the 60s?
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, by 2024, the voter market is very different to what the market has been to date because of the importance of young people. To date, many young people haven't registered to vote, so they haven't yet made as pronounced an impact as they might. You see them in the potential vote that doesn't vote. As long as we remain a free society, as long as we remain the breakup, the free society that doesn't meet expectations, I say the ANC loses. And it loses largely because of that youth vote. The only way to head that off without structural reform is to destroy civil rights in order to control the institutions that are able to cook the books and to hold elections such as the recent election in Zimbabwe. I see 1, 2, 3, 4 towards the back. Yes, sir.
75% to change Section 25 of the Constitution. Is that correct?
I don't know. There's an argument about whether it's 75 or 2/3. But there's another argument that you don't need to change Section 25. But you can probably, particularly if you consider the prospects of custodial takings, achieve the same result without a constitutional amendment. And that's where the real danger lies. A week ago, the government withdrew the expropriation bill, said they're sending it back for redrafting. And the trick that analysts mustn't miss is that the constitutional review process says no on a constitutional change, and the expropriation bill is drafted in the afterglow of that decision to give the state precisely the same powers. I think the expropriation bill is something we've been fighting since I think 2008, and we've shot it down a few times. And its initial drafting would have amounted to a constitutional change. I think if the ANC can get the constitutional change, they'll pursue it. They're politicians, they pursue power, this gives them immense power. But don't think that what happened at the review committee today, or that decision that will later be taken, is a decision that determines the future for property rights in the country. There are other areas, terrains of struggle, to use the revolutionary term, that we must watch very closely, that if they go wrong can cause just as much damage. The three at the back.
My first question was a quick question until that gentleman said something which has added a second one. So the first one was the breakup. You mentioned, was it Venezuela was an example of a breakup?
No, Venezuela's bottom left. The breakup is, we'll be a global cutting-edge example of enclave formation.
A real country that we can look at and see this
pieces. Oyster Bay in Tanzania looks like an enclave. Israel's position in the Middle East is an enclave of sorts and shows how robust enclaves can be. Stain City is an enclave. We could drive around the corner and go and Waterfall's an enclave, but these are what we call first generation enclaves. They're very simple things. You've built a huge wall, it's like a medieval city, and everyone's going to live in the middle and guards patrol the outside. But your life and actions and so on are still happening largely outside of the walls. You have to they lower the drawbridge in the morning, and everyone rushes through the traffic and hopes to make it home in the evening. Have they all come back? Is the question.
Something that you
These are first generation enclaves. Second generation enclaves and third generation enclaves will be vastly more sophisticated. They'll be networked through modern communications and other technology, crypto and other currencies that I know absolutely nothing about. But people who know a bit more suggest to me that they will be quite important in enclave formation. And ultimately, that's where your enclave has a very strong, almost virtual component to it. And ultimately, you get third generation enclaves, which is the next book that's on the way, in fact. And these are a mindset, ultimately. The enclaves become a mindset that what happens in the union buildings will have an effect on your life, of course. But it's irrelevant in the sense that it determines what your life will ultimately be like. And that you take charge of your own life, your own world, and you secure a very high standard of living as a result of that. South Africa then becomes a pace setter for enclave formation in contested societies around the world. And a theme we're developing that we don't yet understand is they're not only elite enclaves, we've spoken about those tonight, but you have enclave formation in deep rural areas, so traditional leaders might play some role in that, and you get enclaves on the urban fringes that will perhaps resemble the gang cultures of South America or parts of Cape Town. But our thinking on that is not very advanced yet.
So there isn't really a case study out there that...
No, nothing we are the case study. We are so deep in this enclave thing already, and we don't realize. I think the numbers are that in '94 there were 100,000 policemen and 100,000 security guards. Policemen who did proper police work, boots on the ground work. And today there are 150,000 boots on the ground policemen and 500,000 security guards in the country. And the 500,000 includes a lot of the initial 100,000 that was in the police. So, and if you can so quietly, without noticing, outsource your security in a free and open society, to the extent that we've done, it shows you what the potential for enclave formation under pressure is actually going to be.
The second thing that I wanted to was just, you mentioned, you spend a lot of time out there, so you speak to people. I've spent some time in communities as well. You said that Ramaphosa, this taking sort of, if he had the opportunity initially, he potentially missed an opportunity to take the top group out, put them in prison, lock them up, throw away the key. The argument that's been out there for that kind of approach and to why he's taken the long run, the long game, has been that it would have split the ANC and that it would have caused even more trouble, that his vote was too close to call. My experience is that that was right. I mean, there would have been blood on the streets in the areas that I've been in because you were either for or you were against. There was no way in between. And if you were the one camp, you were the enemy of the other. Did that not play out? Do you not think that would have played out in the South African scenario?
It does play out, and that's the point that's made, and it's a legitimate point. And the analyst community that holds that point may be right. And maybe that was his reasoning. What his reasoning was is difficult to determine. I'm unconvinced again because of that popularity polling that was done on him towards the end of last year that showed amongst people he had a vast lead. And ANC backbenchers aren't the types to force their opinions on the party. Tends to go the other way around. And as much as the risks were significant, I think it could have been done and it could have been pulled off. But we stand here talking about he was in the moment. Didn't even know if they were going to win in the days before the race. And they didn't really win either because he won, but the rest looks pretty much like the infrastructure of before. However, the counter to your point is that going slowly while punting Marxist dogma could have no result other than driving South Africa into a recession, frightening people, scaring off the investment community. And ultimately, if we're right, which I'm confident we are, that ANC supporters vote on their material circumstances more on fervour, setting his party up for a real political problem in the post-election era. There was a hand to your left, right, yes.
France, Mr. Ramaphosa is a very wealthy individual, and I'm sure each of these different scenarios affects his portfolio significantly. So, is it at all a feasible strategy to track his investments to gain a sense of to gain a sense of what he's thinking? Because nobody, from what I've heard, is that the long-term strategists think that he's playing a long game, but you're not convinced. I mean, nobody has a definitive answer.
It's an interesting point. You see where he was. Imagine if you've got sufficient wealth and a little bit offshore, as many people do.
I mean, you know,
Well, it's just sort of
I'll have my
Well,
answer for me. You know?
There's some business journalists here this evening. Maybe we'll read about it in a few days' time in some of the newspapers. But it's an interesting point. Hard to answer, I don't know.
The data, that's what you want.
Leon told me to stop, so I've got one. Was there another one in that back row? I saw one hand. Is that it? Yep. Okay, one more. Yeah.
One of your early slides showed a very good correlation between ANC support and growth in the country. At the end of the growth rate, I think they had the highest support. It seems to me that's a hell of a good argument to go to them and say, chaps, you must be focusing on growth and nothing else. Now, if you do that, you've then got to tell them how to get growth. All the things that we know how to get growth is exactly what they don't want to do. I mean, you know our book, Economic Freedom of the World. I mean, you've got to get rid of state-owned enterprises, you've got to privatise, you've got all the things you're talking about, the labour legislation and so on. So it's a hell of a problem, and I know you guys are also trying to change the thinking there. Question, do the ANC actually know? Are there people in the ANC actually know how to go about to get growth? I mean, we're not sure about that. In other words, do they know that you've got to do these things that every other country that's got growth before has to achieve?
Yes. Particularly with that thing pointing at me. Yes, I don't think. Well, if I could ask this question in one of those towers in Sandton, I say don't think, not that you've thought that, but don't think that there's ignorance behind this, or that the results come as a massive surprise, the recession, or that the problem is that they don't know, and if someone would just go and say, look, you grew and the economy was growing, understand the correlations. I think that's very well understood. But it's not sufficient to prompt reform. And the reason is that there's a deeper and more important driver, and that's ideological. And to beat ideology, you can't drag the minister kicking and screaming to court, and you can't sit and argue, and the data helps and so on. But ultimately, it was put best to me by a great veteran of these battles who came to see me about now 2 weeks ago and said to me, the ANC will not change its mind on many of the positions it's adopted, expropriation being one. It's too far down that hole, and the ideology behind it, since the late 1960s, particularly too strong. But it might change its perception of the balance of forces, and then it will pull back. And balance of forces theory becomes very important here. That you don't get anywhere with sometimes dogmatic government by making friends or talking nicely. You get somewhere by forcing a new balance of power. And if you're able to force that balance of power, you can get your adversary to pull back. And it's pretty much straight out of the ANC's own strategy and tactics playbook. That you can advance the revolution, to use the language, as long as you meet with no resistance. But when resistance is encountered, you must stop immediately, and if the resistance persists, you must pull back. And that doesn't mean you attack the ANC or call them a bunch of delinquents, as a prominent banker once did. It means that you've got to find pressure points, and you've got to use those pressure points, and you've got to take firm and hard lines. And when you do that and create great pressure, as was the case on the party about a week ago, 10 days ago, on questions of land, it will step back from the front and start writing articles in the Financial Times saying that there's nothing to worry about. And if we're going to win this thing, we'll win it because, looking back, the pressure points were identified and the pressure was exercised. And that's not a hostile action. It's often an action in support of ANC reformers. Those who've asked us about our activities around the world and what we do and who we talk to, and we talk to the moderate middle because the far right already know where they stand on questions of South Africa. What we say when we get asked what we're doing there, and some people get a bit nervous and say, we don't know about this role of yours. We say to them, if you believe that Cyril Ramaphosa is a reformer, as many in business proclaim to do today still, and certainly did a couple of months ago, you've got to admit that everything we've done to date has been in aid of creating the pressure that he will later use to justify the pullback from the precipice that we are approaching far too rapidly. And I think that's the role for organizations like this and for the people that support them, to build and create pressure. You can do that through shifting public opinion, you can create investor pressure, you can do all manner of things. It's ultimately that also explained the transition of the 1990s. The Nats didn't have a moment when they felt very bad about all of this. They ran out of money, essentially, at the end of a decade when groups, including mine and Leon's, had exercised immense pressure on the government and done a lot of work to shape and influence public opinion. And it's ultimately now the success of that work that may determine the trajectory the country takes over the next decade, at which point I thank you all very much for coming. I thank Leon for hosting me. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I think the attendance and the number of people who stayed till the end speaks for itself. I would have expected you to say something about the National Democratic Revolution. Which of the four is it?
Oh, the whole evening was about the National Democratic Revolution.
I think certainly he's probably left us all still somewhat confused about the future, but at a higher level at least. And as the other old cliche goes, that the future isn't what it used to be, and you should never make predictions about the future, and he refused to do just that, which is probably quite wise. I've been asked to give you this gift. It happens to be a book that my wife and I wrote called South Africa the Solution. It's a leather-bound edition. It includes, for example, a foreword by Winnie Mandela, and was, I think to this day, probably still the biggest selling non-fiction book on South Africa. It sold 75,000 copies and it is said to have made a difference. So you get a numbered, leather-bound edition to keep in your library, and thank you very much. And people, of course, can stay and socialise. There's still some wine and cheese, I think.